In
Bar 42,
1991,
14
India
kilograms.
stood 18
Noted.
days away from default.
Seal the
Its
crate.
foreign reserves could barely cover 3 weeks of imports. Gold reserves were flown secretly to London and pledged as collateral just to keep the lights on. The economy that had spent 4 decades locked behind tariff walls, licenses, and state control was, by every measure, failing. Then something changed. Within a generation, that same nation would become the 5th largest economy on Earth, a nuclear power courted by every major bloc, a launch pad for spacecraft that reached the Moon and Mars, and home to more billionaires and more software engineers than almost any country in history. How does a nation go from begging for emergency loans to negotiating as an equal with Washington, Moscow, and Beijing in the span of 30 years? This is not a simple story of miracle growth. It is a story of crisis forcing reform, of a demographic wave meeting a digital revolution at exactly the right moment, of old rivalries reshaped by new ambitions, and of a civilization that never stopped believing its moment would come again. To understand why India is rising so fast today, we have to go back to the edge of collapse and the decision that changed everything. For nearly 200 years, the story of India was written by others. Under British colonial rule, one of the wealthiest civilizations in world history, a region that had once accounted for close to a quarter of global economic output, was steadily reduced to a supplier of raw cotton, indigo, and tea, and a captive market for foreign manufactured goods. Famine swept the subcontinent with grim regularity. Railways were built not to connect Indian cities to each other, but to move resources to ports for export, and by the time independence arrived in August 1947, India's share of the world economy had collapsed to a fraction of what it had been at the start of colonial rule. Independence brought freedom, but not immediate prosperity. The subcontinent was partitioned in violence and displacement on a scale the world had rarely witnessed, with millions killed and tens of millions uprooted from homes their families had occupied for centuries. The new Indian state inherited mass illiteracy, minimal industry, fragile institutions, and a population traumatized by partition's wounds. Jawaharlal Nehru, India's first prime minister, chose a path of cautious state-led development. Heavy industry backed by the government, a vast and often inefficient bureaucracy to regulate private enterprise, and a foreign policy of non-alignment that kept India distant from both Cold War blocs. For decades, this model, often nicknamed the License Raj for its labyrinth of permits, quotas, and approvals required to start or expand a business, produced modest, unspectacular growth. Economists at the time coined a term for it, the Hindu rate of growth, a derisive shorthand for an economy that expanded at barely 3 to 4% a year, just enough to keep pace with population growth, but not nearly enough to lift the majority out of poverty. Meanwhile, India's neighbors in East Asia, Japan, then South Korea, then Taiwan, then Singapore, opened themselves to trade and foreign investment and began racing ahead. India, protective and inward-looking, was left behind. By the late 1980s, the cracks in this model had become fissures. Successive governments borrowed heavily to fund subsidies and public spending without matching productivity gains. The Gulf War in 1990 sent oil prices spiking at the worst possible moment, and remittances from Indian workers in the Gulf states, a crucial source of foreign currency, dried up as those workers fled the conflict zone. Foreign exchange reserves, already thin, evaporated with alarming speed. By June 1991, India held barely enough hard currency to cover roughly 2 to 3 weeks of essential imports. International credit rating agencies downgraded the country's debt. The government, desperate to avoid a sovereign default, authorized the physical transport of national gold reserves to the Bank of England and to Swiss vaults, pledged as collateral for emergency loans. It was a moment of profound national humiliation for a country that saw itself as an emerging civilizational power, forced to mortgage its gold to keep functioning. Out of that crisis came reform. A new government, led by Prime Minister P.V. Narasimha Rao, appointed an economist named Manmohan Singh as finance minister. Singh, working with a small team of reform-minded officials, moved with a speed almost unimaginable for the Indian bureaucracy. Import tariffs were slashed. The rupee was devalued and partially floated. Industrial licensing requirements, the notorious permits that had strangled entrepreneurship for decades, were abolished for all but a handful of sensitive sectors. Foreign investment, long treated with suspicion, was cautiously welcomed. In his budget speech, Singh famously quoted Victor Hugo, declaring that no power on earth could stop an idea whose time had come. The line was aimed squarely at economic liberalization, and it proved prophetic. The reforms of 1991 did not create India's rise by themselves, but they removed the walls that had contained it. What followed was not overnight transformation, but the slow, compounding unlocking of a population and a talent base that had been waiting, in many cases for generations, for the chance to build. The most visible early beneficiary of liberalization was India's technology sector. Cities like Bengaluru, previously known mostly for its pleasant climate and public sector research institutes, became magnets for a new kind of company. Software services firms that could hire English-speaking, technically trained graduates at a fraction of Western salaries and sell their labor globally through the emerging infrastructure of the Internet. Firms such as Infosys, Wipro, and Tata Consultancy Services, some founded years before liberalization but constrained by the old system, expanded explosively once permitted to operate with fewer bureaucratic obstacles. The Y2K crisis at the turn of the millennium, when companies worldwide scrambled to fix legacy computer code before the date change, became an unlikely catalyst, proving to Western corporations that Indian engineers could deliver complex technical work reliably and affordably. What began as outsourced back-office coding evolved, over 2 decades, into sophisticated research and development, cloud computing services, and increasingly homegrown Indian technology products competing globally in their own right. Underneath the technology boom lay a deeper structural force: demographics. Unlike China, whose one-child policy would eventually produce a rapidly aging population, India retained a much younger age structure. By the early 21st century, India possessed one of the largest working-age populations on the planet, with hundreds of millions of people entering the labor force over succeeding decades. Economists call this a demographic dividend, the economic boost that occurs when a large share of a population is of working age, supporting fewer dependents and producing more than it consumes. If matched with education, healthcare, and job creation, a demographic dividend can supercharge growth for decades. If mismanaged, it can instead become a demographic burden, a mass of underemployed and frustrated youth. India's story over the past 30 years has, in large part, been the ongoing struggle to capture that dividend rather than squander it, through expanding higher education, digital literacy programs, and infrastructure investment, even as hundreds of millions still await better job opportunities. The 2000s and 2010s saw successive governments across political lines continue and often accelerate the liberalization begun in 1991. The government led by Atal Bihari Vajpayee pushed further privatization and infrastructure investment, including a landmark national highway program. The subsequent Congress-led government under Manmohan Singh, now Prime Minister himself, oversaw a period of rapid growth, sometimes touching 8 or 9% annually, alongside a landmark civil nuclear agreement with the United States that effectively ended India's decades of nuclear isolation following its 1974 and 1998 weapons tests. From 2014 onward, the government led by Narendra Modi pursued an ambitious agenda combining continued economic liberalization with large-scale infrastructure spending. A sweeping and controversial nationwide goods and services tax intended to unify India's fragmented state-level tax system into a single national market, and an aggressive push toward digital governance. Programs like Aadhaar, a biometric identification system covering over 1 billion residents, and the Unified Payments Interface, a real-time digital payment system that would come to process tens of billions of transactions monthly, dramatically reduced the friction of doing business and receiving government benefits, cutting out layers of corruption and inefficiency that had long plagued welfare delivery. Manufacturing, long India's weak point compared to China's export juggernaut, became a deliberate policy focus. Programs like Make in India and later production-linked incentive schemes sought to attract global manufacturers, particularly in electronics and semiconductors, partly by offering financial incentives and partly by capitalizing on a geopolitical shift already underway. Global companies, especially in electronics and consumer technology, increasingly sought to diversify their supply chains away from overwhelming reliance on China. Apple's expansion of iPhone assembly into Indian factories in the 2020s became one of the most visible symbols of this shift, though India's manufacturing base remained, by most measures, still well behind China's in scale and sophistication. Space exploration became another arena where India punched above its economic weight. The Indian Space Research Organization, operating on budgets that were often a small fraction of NASA's or the European Space Agency's, achieved a string of headline-grabbing successes. A Mars orbiter mission that succeeded on its first attempt in 2014, an achievement no other nation had managed. And in 2023, the Chandrayaan-3 mission's successful landing near the Moon's South Pole, making India the fourth nation to achieve a controlled lunar landing and the first to do so in that particularly difficult polar region. These missions were not merely scientific achievements. They were carefully choreographed statements of national capability and prestige, aimed as much at domestic pride and international perception as at pure research. Geopolitically, India's rise reshaped its relationships with every major power. The Cold War-era closeness with the Soviet Union gradually gave way to a far more complex, multi-aligned foreign policy. Relations with the United States, historically cool and, at times, openly hostile. Washington had tilted toward Pakistan during multiple Cold War crises and sanctioned India after its 1998 nuclear tests. Warmed dramatically from the 2000s onward, driven by shared concerns over China's rising power, growing trade and technology ties, and an enormous Indian diaspora in the United States that had become deeply influential in American business, academia, and politics. India also deepened partnerships with Japan, Australia, and France, and became a founding member of groupings like the Quadrilateral Security Dialogue, explicitly framed around balancing Chinese influence in the Indo-Pacific. At the same time, India maintained its historic defense relationship with Russia and continued purchasing discounted Russian oil even after the invasion of Ukraine drew Western sanctions, a stance that frustrated Western governments but underscored India's insistence on strategic autonomy rather than firm alignment with any single bloc. The relationship with China, India's most consequential and complicated, oscillated between cooperation and confrontation. Both nations shared a long, disputed Himalayan border that had already produced a brief but bloody war in 1962. Decades of relative calm were shattered in June 2020 when a violent clash in the Galwan Valley left soldiers dead on both sides, the first combat fatalities along that border in over 4 decades. The confrontation hardened Indian public opinion against China, accelerated Indian efforts to reduce economic dependence on Chinese supply chains, and pushed New Delhi further toward Western and Quad partnerships, even as substantial trade between the two Asian giants continued. None of this rise has been without serious friction. India's growth remains deeply uneven, with hundreds of millions still living in poverty and vast disparities between its gleaming technology hubs and its rural interior. Air pollution in cities like Delhi regularly reaches hazardous levels. Religious and caste tensions periodically erupt into violence, testing the secular and pluralist framework the republic's founders built into its constitution. Unemployment among educated youth remains a persistent political flashpoint, and job creation has often failed to keep pace with the number of young people entering the workforce each year. Critics, both domestic and international, have raised concerns about the erosion of press freedom, judicial independence, and protections for religious minorities under recent governments. India's rise, in other words, is neither linear nor guaranteed, and its trajectory continues to be shaped by internal political battles as consequential as any external rivalry. Yet by any broad historical measure, the transformation has been extraordinary. A nation that mortgaged its gold reserves in 1991 to avoid default became, within roughly 3 decades, the fifth largest economy in the world by nominal GDP, projected by many economists to climb further in the coming years. Its technology sector, born from Cold War-era isolation and Y2K-era outsourcing contracts, now produces globally competitive firms, a thriving startup ecosystem, and one of the most sophisticated digital public infrastructure systems on Earth. Its space program lands spacecraft on the moon on budgets smaller than the cost of a single Hollywood blockbuster. Its diaspora leads major global corporations, and its diplomats are courted by every capital that matters. The country that once seemed permanently defined by the shadow of its colonial past and by the humiliation of its own near collapse in 1991 has instead become one of the central actors shaping the 21st century's balance of power, wealth, and technology. Whether India fully converts this momentum into lasting prosperity for all its citizens, or whether the deep inequalities and political tensions running beneath its rise eventually slow it down, remains one of the defining open questions of the coming decades. But the story of how it got this far, from the edge of bankruptcy to a seat at nearly every major table on Earth, stands as one of the most remarkable national turnarounds of the modern era, and a case study every rising or struggling economy will study for generations to come.